Thank you very much. So what I will be talking about, I will be basically appending on Professor Reichalt's speech, and I will be using the context he presented to talk a bit more about the more recent history of violence in human societies. And for that, I will be using examples from my home country, from Estonia. So as we heard in the evolution of Homo sapiens, violence has played a big role, and so has a very closely related characteristic, aggression, and namely in helping for hunting, for protecting our group from others, and also for creating in-group hierarchies. And when I was browsing through Professor Reichalt's slides, the first thing I thought about, also from my experience, was the comparison between Aboriginal people in Australia and the Maori people in New Zealand. How really, in contemporary society, how they are very different. And so I sort of looked into why is that? And when one looks back, Maoris are very violent towards each other and towards also the intruders coming to their country. For example, Captain Cook arriving in New Zealand, a big part of his crew was murdered and eaten by Maoris. On the other hand, Aboriginal people, they were rather pacifistic and curious, if anything, towards intruders. So the why is that could be answered also what Professor Reichelt presented due to the temporal and spatial distribution of resources. But also for me, it shows that violence has played a big role in the development of these groups. And when we look at contemporary New Zealand and Australia, we see that Maoris do have play a very much bigger role in New Zealand culture, in New Zealand identity, than do the Aboriginals. Moving on. So once we, in the development of human society, we at some point figured out we would have to create a state to sort of channel down the violence. And as philosopher Hobbes has said, that a state is created to avoid the arbitrary violence, or Max Weber defined the state to be the monopoly of violence, meaning that state is legally the only party that has been given the rights to use violence. And throughout history, many individuals and governments have taken the right to define these rules after what violence should be and to which extent violence should be exercised. And I would like to present you a case of Estonia where violence has been used to a very big extent and misused. Very shortly about Estonia. Estonia is about 1.3 million people. Is located on the southern coast of Baltic Sea. It's about the same area as Switzerland. Throughout our history, here you can see red, we've been occupied. Before 13th century, we could do whatever we wanted on that piece of land. Ever since 13th century, we've been having people coming in from either from Denmark, 13th century, Germany, 13th century, Swedes, Poles in the 16th century, Russians in the 18th century, Germans in the First World War, then the Russians in 1940, then the Germans 1941, and finally the Russians 1944, when the Second World War ended and Estonia became part of the Soviet Union. All of the intruders had used violence to achieve their goals. However, the Soviet rule was the most devastating and cruelest for the people of Estonia. And I would just like to use the framework presented by Professor Reichelt in dividing up the violence into three groups, and just to demonstrate how that was the case in the Soviet Union. First of all, we have the intergroup violence, which was the oppression of all of the small individual identities, nations within the Soviet Union. A lot of them did become extinct, and here is just an illustration of Santa Claus as the oppression of the culture. Christmas was not to be celebrated on the 24th of December. It was supposed to be celebrated somewhere else. So in Estonia, Christmas was to be celebrated secretly. in-group violence, we have basically moral oppression. So within the context of the greater Soviet Union, this is the group. Any non-conformists were either morally suppressed or eliminated from the society, taken to Siberia and so on. And finally, as part of the ideology of Soviet Union was certainly the interspecific violence of man towards nature, where I've chosen the example of the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, who supported and initiated the plan of the Northern River Reversal Project in Siberia, where they wanted to turn the river flow around to basically lead it to a non-arable land. Anyhow, Soviet Union didn't last for long. Well, it lasted for 45 years, but it didn't last forever. I find there was nothing sustainable about it, and I don't find it surprising that it collapsed. However, what I do find surprising is that when it did collapse, it didn't collapse with violence. It collapsed very calmly. And I would like to point out two examples of how, especially in Estonia, activities were carried through which sort of supported the bloodless resistance. First of all, the singing revolution, which happened in the late 80s, where about 300,000 people from Estonia came together. They didn't go for their guns, they started singing. They started singing songs about the land, about the nature, about the sea, about freedom. And basically when 300,000 people, about a third of the whole nation comes together, the Russian police and military couldn't do anything, or the Soviet police couldn't do anything. Second example is the Baltic Chain, where the people from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania held hands from the capital of Tallinn until the capital of Lithuania, about 650 kilometers long distance covered with 2 million people. So these two examples give me hope that conflict situations can also be solved through nonviolent means. Now, when referring to the fact that language and cultural differences do create conflicts and do maybe emphasize the potential for violence, I would like to point out one event in the very recent Estonian history, the Bronze Soldier event, where in Estonia we have about 1/3 of the people living in Estonia are Russians, Russian heritage, and that has caused a lot of problems within the last 20 years while trying to integrate, and it hasn't been as smooth as one would think. So anyways, this story about the Bronze Soldier, it commemorates the fallen Soviet soldiers in the Second World War, and up until 2 years ago, that was in the middle of the Estonian capital, Tallinn. There was a lot of problems already throughout the years because the Estonian public did not appreciate that, and also the Estonian government decided to act. This is also what happened right before, dirty tricks like that. Anyways, when the Estonian government did decide to react on that and remove the statue overnight, then let's see what happened next. Okay, that's enough of that. So basically, the youth, or let's say the most radical part of the Russian minority in Estonia, decided to riot against in Tallinn and destroy basically all of the ground floor shops and businesses. For me, I'm not going to analyze the conflict. There's a lot of reasons behind there, but for me, I can draw out some conclusions from there. First of all, there was a huge potential for a very big intergroup conflict there, for the Estonian youth also to react on that case. It didn't happen. That I consider a success story. That the Estonians there didn't go into there. It's not to say that the Estonians are the bonobos here and the Russians are the chimpanzees, but it is to say that it is a development in the right direction for me. On the other hand, when the police was interviewing the people rioting in that event, one would find out that there were also a couple of Estonians, and when they were asked, why did you do that? Why did you go and break the windows? I don't know. Everyone was doing it. I find it cool, you know? And then that shows me there are still within us the sense to go with the flow and go with the violence, and when the given conditions and circumstances are right, this is what happens. And yeah. So, in conclusion, I would like to say that we live in a very globalized society these days. This is the picture of all the planes throughout the one day that you can see around the world. I think we are culturally, lingually, informationally, and also infrastructurally connected more than ever before in our history. I think besides trying to eliminate the negative consequences of globalization, as the carbon emissions in the atmosphere, I would really emphasize the fact that we can use the positive consequences of globalization as events like this for networking and for finding out the root causes of violence and also implementing them in our countries. And also, I would like to think that for the elimination of violence, which I firmly believe is learnable, and I firmly believe that also peace is learnable. I just think it needs a step forward in the collective psychological thinking or evolution of the feeling of empathy. Thank you very much.
Okay, can you understand me? Yes. The question is whether I understand myself. So thank you very much, both of you. I'll be with you just in a moment. I saw that, or I noticed that our first experiment worked. So both protagonists have obviously talked to each other before the lecture, and because you gave some reference to the slides of Professor Reichhold, and so this was part of the trial that we did. Thank you very much for behaving so properly in terms of theory.
His achievement. It was simply his achievement. We hadn't talked together.
Ah, okay. No. Then this was the misinterpretation of the experimentator. So they asked me not to give a lecture myself. So we have the first question over there.
Yes, it's not really a question, but it's Darwin's year, and I think it's very good to go back to Darwin's. And in Darwin's, of course, we read in the book of 1879. We read a lot about violence, about terrible fight, about competition. But,
thank you.
But when Madame Darwin got the first draft of the book, she said, doesn't work. And Darwin went back to his book and wrote a famous chapter on what is going wrong with this theory and why it's so difficult to grasp. And while writing this book, this chapter, he found out that there is a real deep problem, and it is the problem of altruism. And he found that altruism is a big problem because, by definition, if a gene of altruism is coming, this gene is going to be eliminated because, by definition, altruism is helping the other more than you help yourself. And so he came with the idea that this is really the crux of my theory, and we have to find a better solution. And it took a long, long time to come and slowly develop solution. And nowadays, most people who think they have a solution focus on the fact that altruism can only develop in parallel with competition and with aggressivity. And aggressivity and altruism are both sides which help each other. Aggressivity is very natural, can't be explained easily. We have good explanation. But altruism is more difficult to explain. And in fact, perhaps all this evolution on aggressivity has to be considered also because aggressivity makes possible that on the other side, within the group, friendship and collaboration developed. But however, we have within the group collaboration, fight toward the other, and respect of the moral inside the group. And this respect of the moral, it's a kind of moral which is adhering to the rules. And the rules are not very simple to develop, and they are not moral in the sense we understand now. Sorry for being so long.
Comment to that?
Well, can I have...
Yeah, sure.
Darf ich kurz in Deutsch antworten, um das kürzer zu machen? Das Altruismusproblem ist als Problem größer dargestellt, als es in Wirklichkeit ist. Es ist keine Frage, dass viele altruistisch erscheinende Tätigkeiten für Außenstehende so wirken, aber dass sie auch, und das hat Amos Zahavi sehr nachdrücklich betont, dem Egoismus des altruistisch sich Verhaltenden zugutekommen. Das braucht sich gar nicht genetisch auszuzahlen. Es hebt den Status bis zum Friedensnobelpreis.
I go on with a question myself. We talked about education. You had it implicit in your part of your conclusions. You named it. You even put some hope in education. Now, considering genetics of physiology, then we can say that we are not so plastic as we hope to be, because we need a certain household of biochemistry or whatever that keeps us in that status that we are. And to quote Reinberger from MP in Berlin, there is no education that can make us see in 4 dimensions. So, if violence is a basic principle, I would even say is a basic language that can be understood in between all the cultures that are differentiating us. If this is a basic biological concept, then no education, I'm playing the advocatus diaboli, no education would help to overcome any of our problems that we have in the violation, because it would be a necessitative constant of a human being. Is that what you would agree to?
In principle, yes. It would be very, very difficult to change a deeply rooted aggressive behavior into what we call a good behavior. We need something like Konrad Lorenz called it ein Ventil, die Aggression abzubauen. Some releases of aggression which are directed to the good side, but help to bring down the levels of aggression which had been built up. And I think our greatest challenge is, especially for young people, to give them both a good and a good position at present and a perspective for reaching better positions. If there is no hope for future, then destroying the present is the only chance.
Would you like to fight back?
No, not to fight back, but in terms of education, I think I really think the good examples of solving conflicts without violence can serve a great deal in terms of learning and in terms of inspiration for future conflict solutions. And I also believe there's a tipping point. Things don't look as bad as they do right now. I really believe in the tipping point effect, that once we are able to cut the circle of violence, once we're able to, for example, isolate young people from seeing violence, from experiencing violence, it will not carry on. It is, I believe, maybe it's a naive thought, but I believe it's possible to root it out. Yeah.
Yes, please.
I would like to bring in another example, like Kurt Spielmann this morning talked about famous psychological experiences like the Milgram in 61 or 62. Another one which was made, which is very famous, is in a kindergarten. I mean, the experience setting is that you have a kindergarten, you put in 15 kids, they have a lot of tools to play, and they play nicely. Then they bring in 5 kids more, 5 kids more. They always bring in more kids, but they also bring in more tools. So actually, all kids have enough tools to play. But from a certain moment on, the kids start to hit each other on their heads. So regardless if they have enough or not, the aggressivity comes out. What I want to say with this example is that when you have aggressivity, which is biologically in ourselves, I believe that too, it's natural, if it's the gene or whatever, but you need always a kind of a situation, a stimulus, that the aggressivity comes out, or violence comes out. So when we want to prevent violence, or to go more for a non-violent society or group, we have to try to have situations where that stimulus doesn't allow to come out so strongly. You can see the same thing in a football game, you know, when you have masses of people, aggressivity automatically grows, normally, not always. And this example, this experiment in psychology shows it very well, because the children are not aware, you know, 4 years old, what they actually do.
This was a comment, not a question. Yeah. Sorry. No. I'm happy with that. But isn't it? And I like to stay with this for a moment. Isn't that the problem that we have not yet had into the discussion, introduced into the discussion, the problems of values? So the argument that you made was purely quantitative. You have more children and more tools. Probably not every tool has the same meaning to every child, so that the competition starts because of the different individual values of the tools towards the child. And so that is always the question of the quantitative, or the problem of the quantitative measurements. But you may have other comments to that.
No, I'm agreeing. It's certainly a question of numbers. The children are not able to create relations with 50 other children. That's a must much too big for them to handle. They need smaller groups where every child becomes acquainted with the others and can act like a large family. But if we have the normal situation in our kindergartens, they are not acting like large families, but one has an adult person which has the power and the mass of equal-aged children. And of course this mass tries to structure itself, and it is structured by the first signs of violence.
We had another incredibly interesting outlook that you gave at the end. That was that we are going to separate ourselves into probably different species. So that brings me back to a very puzzling notion what a species is. So when I try to digest the recent books on evolution biology or evolutionary biology, then I get even more puzzled because the definition of a species gets more and more and more vague the more we know about molecular biology, and we simply cannot frame this in terms of phenomenology. And therefore we have developed ideas that a species is maybe rather determined by a contextual mechanism than by a biological mechanism.
It's a process. Speciation is a process. It's never ending in a certain stage, which could be called a fixed number of species, but it is a process which we would like to see as finished. And let me give another example in German for reasons of shortness. Wir haben eine parallele Entwicklung in der Singvogelwelt. Singvögel unterscheiden sich am stärksten durch Gesänge, die in gewisser Weise unseren Sprachen entsprechen. Ich bin Ornithologe von Haus aus. Wenn mir jemand gerupfte Singvögel zeigen würde, ohne Gefieder, hätte ich größte Schwierigkeiten, die Arten zu bestimmen. Wenn sie singen, ist es ganz leicht und sie erkennen untereinander auch sich am Gesang. Das heißt, wir haben hier eine Parallele, auch wenn sehr weit gefasst, zu dem, was in unserer gesamtmenschlichen Kultur mit der Evolution der Sprachen zustande gekommen ist. Eine Trennung in Gruppen, die einander dann nicht mehr verstehen und als andersartig einstufen, als Prozess und nicht als festgefügte Einheit.
Haben wir eine Idee, wie schnell solche Prozesse laufen? Oder beschleunigen? Switching to English. Do we have an idea how fast these processes are, or do we permanently accelerate these processes just by our cultural influence? I mean, we have synergistic cultural and biological synergistic effects with all the problems of modern, or not the problems, the achievements of modern medicine, for example.
We scientists are a good example, creating new forms of language which are only understood within the certain circles, and we are behaving like separated from the rest of the world, to bring it on into the nutshell, of course. But it is not far from truth.
So you got your program because you bear our hopes that you will develop within a decent time into more well-behaving species. Looking on my wristwatch, I think I at the moment have to close this part of the discussion and leading over to the next question. And being a pharmacist, of course, I'm fascinated by the idea, whatever you told us about the contextual behavior of this species forming and the importance of proteins, that I could say it's all about chemistry, because it's pheromones, it's nutrition, it's small heterozygotic molecules that are somehow digested in a form and metabolized that they can act in our brains and make us the personality. Maybe I could even say the bacteria in my intestine have a decisive influence on what the metabolite reception is, and would help to shape a species or a personality. And so if we are going, I'm ironic, of course, please don't mix it up. If we try to break it down a little bit more in this molecular direction, then this gives me the chance to announce the next speaker, which is Gerhard Roth. For the while, gentlemen, thank you very much.